an ideal to strive towards.
Was it a sign of the times, the artistic sensibility of a director, or perhaps an attempt to copy a previous success?
Do I really look like a guy with a plan?
Whatever the reason, one thing is certain. 2013's Man of Steel, featuring a brand new Superman, was a huge deviation from what we'd previously seen on the big screen. Darker and grittier, with an emphasis on realism while being weighed down with moral complexity. The tone is intense, with a focus on existential threats and large-scale destruction.
And I will rebuild Krypton atop his bones.
Gone were the days of mythic heroism, wrapped in a lighter, more optimistic tone and infused with a sense of wonder and hope.
I'm here to fight for truth and justice in the American way.
And while some fans initially scoffed at the change, others embraced it. And just as had happened before, a new generation found their Superman. But what started as the reboot of a beloved hero, complete with planned character-centered sequels, it was quickly morphed into a vehicle created to chase the success of another studio's superhero franchise. And when it would fail, the question that would be left on the minds of many Superman fans is, what might have been?
In a pre-Zero Hour DC universe.
In what was supposed to be a 5-movie Superman-focused story arc, fans would only receive 3. And of the 536 minutes in these movies, the red cape would only be seen in 120 of them, or about 22% of the time. And as uncertainty about the future of this Man of Steel would unfold during a worldwide pandemic, just as he was about to make a triumphant return thanks to one of the most famous and exhilarating DC end credit scenes of all time,
Black Adam, we should talk.
the studio would abruptly change its mind and officially end that version of Superman, despite grossing more than $2 billion at the box office worldwide. Needless to say, fans who felt he was their Superman could hardly be consoled, as his time as the brooding and introspective Kal-El had been not only brief, but incomplete. Although perhaps you'd be brooding too if you had to let your father die when you could have saved him. But more on that later. What would begin as a successful start to a new Superman franchise would almost immediately face a choice of which path to take. And that path would ultimately decide the fate of the most popular superhero character of all time. While the ultimate determination of the wisdom of the studio's decision to move on will be determined by the success or failure of the next Superman,
Hey buddy, eyes up here.
in the meantime, we have some questions. What was behind the change to Superman's character? Why did the studio change directions after Man of Steel? What was the key moment that would eventually bring it all to an end? And most importantly, why a red-headed Lois Lane? Well, you are about to find out, because this is the definitive history of Henry Cavill's Superman, and you've never heard it told like this before. And if you haven't already subscribed to our channel, please do so now, and give us a thumbs up if you want more videos like this. Also, consider supporting the channel by getting one of these limited collector's edition designs. Use coupon code THEPOPCAST at checkout for a nice discount. There will be a link at the end of this video. Thank you for the support. If you ever wondered who the most well-known fictional character in modern pop culture is, at least since the 1940s, you'd be hard-pressed not to put Superman right at the top of that list.
Looks like a job for Superman.
You're not exactly Superman.
Superman is a real guy.
Superman.
Superman.
Superman?
Superman.
Superman. Be Superman.
I, Superman.
Be their Superman.
Superman.
Superman wants to get laid.
Ever since Siegel and Schuster introduced him to the world in 1938, people have been fascinated by a being that is nearly all-powerful, but will stop to help a cat out of a tree without a second thought.
Every time your hero saves a cat out of a tree, you read a puff piece editorial.
Ilya Salkind, who sold the idea to put Superman on the big screen in the 1970s, would close the deal by saying next to Elvis, Gandhi, and Jesus Christ, Superman is probably one of the most well-known figures in history. And why not? An alien with the ability to destroy humankind, but instead embraces truth, justice, and the American way, with his ultimate goal protecting Earth and all of its inhabitants? Who wouldn't love that?
I just wish you could all see the Earth the way that I see it.
This selfless super being, a souped-up Boy Scout, would become our first widely recognized superhero. And he would ride a wave of post-World War II hopefulness in the pages of newspapers, comic books, and at the movies in a series of animated shorts in 1941 and 2 movie serials at the end of the decade. By 1952, nearly half of American homes would have a TV set, and that same year, George Reeves' Superman would get his own TV series. As the hopefulness of the 50s gave way to the social change of the 60s, the light of hope shining brightly in the Man of Steel would be snuffed out by the disillusion brought on by cynicism and war through the mid-70s. But thanks to the Salkinds, Richard Donner and Christopher Reeve, Superman would usher in a new era of hope in 1978, just in time to lead a new wave of optimism brought in by the economic growth of the 80s and a booming movie industry that made people believe anything was possible. That hope would continue in the 90s with Dean Cain via Lois and Clark: The New Adventures of Superman, and in the 2000s with Tom Welling and Smallville. And in 2006, Bryan Singer would produce his ode to Donner and Reeve with Brandon Routh in Superman Returns. Hope, 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 and failure. Perhaps it was because the world had become a different place. The rise of the internet in a post-9/11 existence and a 24-hour news cycle that detailed a world filled with terrorist attacks and endless wars in the Middle East, hope had begun to give way to a gritty realism that was shaping what felt like a darker global existence.
Fool me once. Shame on you.
An idealistic, hopeful Superman didn't seem to resonate in this new reality TV world.
I'm sorry, can you stop breathing so loud, honey? He's like...
And Warner Brothers, who had owned Superman and his DC friends since 1969, had received the message loud and clear.
Here we go.
Not only because Superman Returns had disappointed at the box office, but more importantly because Christopher Nolan's Batman had not. After success with 2005's dark Batman Begins, Nolan's second movie, The Dark Knight, would take the world by storm, becoming only the 4th movie to ever break $1 billion in its first run at the box office, behind only 1998's Titanic, 2003's Return of the King, and 2006's Pirates of the Caribbean: Dead Man's Chest. Warner Brothers knew it had tapped into something, and his name was Christopher Nolan. Only a month after the release of The Dark Knight in August 2008, the studio announced they would be rebooting the Superman franchise. Nolanization had begun.
Welcome to the planet.
Glad to be here, Lois.
While Superman was decidedly under the influence of Nolan, he certainly wasn't aware of it, and the studio wasn't entirely sure where they wanted to go either. In 2008, Routh was still under contract to play Superman, and Bryan Singer was planning to make a sequel titled Superman Returns: The Man of Steel. And while that was the official story, behind the scenes at Warner Brothers, all options were on the table. Before their announcement that they were rebooting the superhero, earlier in 2008, the studio brought in DC comic book writers Grant Morrison, Mark Waid, Jeff Johns, and Brad Meltzer to get their ideas for a reboot. Morrison pitched an idea similar to his work on All-Star Superman, and Waid suggested they follow his work on Superman Birthright. But what Warner Brothers really wanted to know was, how bad was the damage from Superman Returns? Morrison told them it's not that bad. Just treat Superman Returns like Ang Lee's Hulk. Waid reminded them that The Incredible Hulk proved the audience will forgive you and let you redo the franchise. Of course, Ang Lee's 2003 Hulk movie starring Eric Bana was criticized primarily because of the jarring CGI Hulk that looked unconvincing against realistic human characters. Meanwhile, 2008's The Incredible Hulk, while not exceptional, was praised for its action sequences and Edward Norton's performance. But Meltzer's take may have been what really convinced the studio to change directions with Superman. He suggested not treating him like a walking American flag. He's not a symbol. He has a soul, and that can be difficult to understand. He then went on to explain how most people think Superman was born out of hope and aspiration.
People think that it's because America's the greatest country on earth and World War II was coming and we needed help, but it's not. It's because Jerry Siegel's father was killed. And when Jerry Siegel's father was killed in a robbery, his son wished for a bulletproof man.
That first version of the character couldn't fly, he didn't have X-ray vision, he was bulletproof. That's it. His father couldn't stop a bullet, but Superman could.
And that's why the world got Superman, because this little boy lost his father.
So while the character was created for strength, he was also created out of loss, giving the Man of Steel more layers than anyone had guessed. This gave the studio a lot to think about. About a decade after Meltzer's pitch, an investigation would learn that Jerry's father had actually not been shot, but had died of a heart attack during a robbery at his Cleveland secondhand clothing store. Although, according to the police report, gunshots were heard. Joanne Siegel, Jerry's wife, and also the inspiration behind Lois Lane, would confirm that Jerry's father's death had been the inspiration for Superman, as his earliest sketches show him saving a man at gunpoint that looked a lot like his father. After the comic book writers made their pitch in 2008, Christopher Nolan and writer David Goyer were working on their story for their third Batman movie, The Dark Knight Rises. The duo came down with a serious case of writer's block as they struggled to make the third act of the story work. Nolan told Goyer to go take a week off and they'd regroup after that. During the break, David found himself reading a volume of Superman's old Action comics. A sudden inspiration hit him, and he wrote a 3-page outline for a Superman movie. When he met with Nolan again, he told him he wasn't sure what to do with Batman yet, but he had an interesting idea for Superman. Nolan loved the idea. He loved it so much, in that same meeting he called the president of Warner Brothers, Jeff Robinoff, and told him Goyer has a pitch for Superman I think you guys need to hear. Can we meet you tomorrow? The pair met with Robinoff the next day, and he loved the idea. The idea was to tell a story that made Superman more relatable and place him in a world very much like our own. That more reality-based Superman would create a connection with moviegoers that they've never had before in a movie. Nolan was quick to let Robinoff know he didn't want to direct the film. He still had to make The Dark Knight Rises, and while he wasn't interested in directing the Superman movie, he would produce it and Goyer would write the screenplay. Warner Brothers was in. And why wouldn't they be? Nolan and Goyer at that point had already brought in more than $1 billion, and they would do it again with the third film. Nolan would go on to make 2010's Inception, putting both Batman and Superman temporarily on the back burner. In 2009, Siegel's family won a court ruling that allowed them to recapture 50% of the rights to Superman's origins. The judge ruled that while Warner Brothers didn't owe the family any additional royalties from previous films, if they did not begin production on a Superman film by 2011, the estate would be able to sue for lost revenue on an unproduced film. Warner Brothers was on the clock. Nolan and Goyer would return to the third Batman movie in early 2010, but with Warner Brothers promising a rebooted Superman movie by Christmas 2012, it was apparent there would be a production overlap of the two films. Goyer was working on the script, but who was Nolan going to get to direct Man of Steel? Nolan needed to find a director that could convey Goyer's idea and realize Warner Brothers' new direction for Superman. Nolan's Batman trilogy had created a template of sorts, but who did the producer trust to translate this vision into a successful movie? Whoever it was, Warner Brothers would have to agree.
I'm not even supposed to be here today.
One of the early candidates was Guillermo del Toro, who had made a name for himself bringing the gritty and brutal Hellboy to the big screen. But he wasn't available. Ben Affleck, who would later play Batman in the next two movies, was offered the chair, but he declined, feeling the project was too big for him at that time. Matt Reeves, who had directed 2008's Cloverfield, was considered but not selected. He would eventually go on to direct 2022's The Batman. Even Robert Zemeckis, director of Back to the Future and Forrest Gump, was called, but he said he turned it down faster than a speeding bullet.
And that's all I have to say about that.
In the end, it was really down to two directors. Tony Scott, brother of directing legend Ridley Scott, who had directed hits like Top Gun, Days of Thunder, and Crimson Tide, and relative newcomer Zack Snyder. Scott had the pedigree, but there was something about Snyder that Nolan was intrigued by. Not only did Snyder's filmmaking include the hyper-stylized visuals found in 2006's 300, but he also featured a fast-paced, gritty, and intense aesthetic in 2004's Dawn of the Dead. Then there was his superhero stuff, 2009's Watchmen and 2011's Sucker Punch. Not what you would call mainstream superhero content.
If you don't stand for something, you'll fall for anything.
But the visuals, storytelling, and unapologetic realness of the characters had elements of what Nolan and Warner Brothers were trying to create with their new Superman. In Watchmen, Snyder had deconstructed the mythology of the superhero. The irony of hiring the same director to reconstruct that mythology in Superman was not lost on Nolan, and he thought it would be a wonderful challenge for the talented director. A director who, in his own words, said 1978's Christopher Reeve's Superman is not the comic book Superman, and he was making the Superman from the comics. Shots fired, bro.
And make no mistake, I will fucking kill you.
But the studio found someone to give them their more realistic and gritty Superman that would follow the tone set by Nolan's Batman. Forget the fact that the first movie Snyder ever made was an unflattering commentary about his high school's administration that got him expelled. Did I mention he got his start making music videos? Well, at the very least, this was going to be interesting. Snyder was officially brought on to direct Man of Steel on October 10, 2010. He had just a little more than 2 years to get the movie made, but he wasn't doing anything until he found a Superman. Toward the end of 2010, Henry Cavill was in the middle of making the movie Immortals when he found out he was being considered to play Superman in the upcoming Man of Steel movie. Little did he know, he wasn't just being considered, but he was a leading candidate. Nothing new for the guy who was considered the unluckiest actor in Hollywood after being passed over as James Bond and being beaten by Robert Pattinson twice in Harry Potter and Twilight.
I don't sleep.
And this wasn't the first time he was seriously being considered for Superman. He was a final choice for McG in his early 2000s Superman Flyby movie until the director backed out. But he would then lose out to Brandon Routh for 2006 Superman Returns. Yes, Henry was used to getting rug pulled. In fact, breaking through in Hollywood hadn't been an easy road for the British actor. Born on May 5, 1983, the fourth of 5 boys in a Catholic family from St. Helier, Jersey, Cavill's first performance was as a member of the T-Birds in a 1999 school production of Grease. In 2000, Russell Crowe was shooting a scene for the film Proof of Life at his school, and Cavill was lucky enough to be an extra. He approached the movie star, stuck out his hand, and told him his name was Henry. He wanted to know how to become an actor. What was it like? And should he go for it? It was a gutsy move. None of the other students had been brave enough to talk to the actor.
And there was just a smile in his eyes, but there was something dead serious behind that smile. So instead of not answering the questions or whatever, because you get asked these questions 100,000 times, I told him the truth.
Acting is fun, and it pays well, but sometimes they don't treat you so good. Other kids then rushed in, and Henry figured that was the end of it. But 2 days later, he received a package in the mail. It was from Crowe.
Because I figured the greatest thing if you're at boarding school must be unexpected mail. It was a photograph from Gladiator. And on Henry's, I put, journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. Basically, if you want it, you go and get it, Yeah.
It served as motivation for the young actor, who would return to the inscription time and time again after long trips out to Los Angeles, missing out on roles and having to wait tables to make enough money to go out and try again. As Russell had said, it was literally becoming a journey of 1,000 miles. Encouraged by the note and the support of his family, he would land a role in the 2001 movie Laguna and the 2002 film The Count of Monte Cristo. In 2005, Cavill would miss out on the role of Cedric Diggory in Harry Potter's Goblet of Fire. He would also lose out as James Bond in the 2006 movie Casino Royale and as Edward Cullen in 2008's Twilight. And then he was cast as a lead in the Showtime television series The Tudors, where he played the charming Duke of Suffolk. People were becoming aware of who Henry Cavill was. So when he got the call to audition for Superman yet again, he had to remind himself he'd been here before and nothing was guaranteed. Up against him for the role was fellow Brit Matthew Goode, the Winklevoss twin Armie Hammer, future Arrowverse Superman actor Tyler Hoechlin, and True Blood star Joe Manganiello, among others.
Ziggy.
Sorry.
Manganiello was so close to getting the role, he had an hour-and-a-half meeting with Snyder, and they were calling True Blood to get his measurements so they could build him a suit. Apparently, that call led to a discussion about his schedule on True Blood interfering with the film Man of Steel. But any talk of Joe became moot when Henry Cavill showed up for his screen test in January 2011. Snyder thought Cavill had an unexplained earnest awesomeness. He was also good-looking, in great shape thanks to his work on Immortals, and he was a great actor. But he needed to see him in the suit. The problem was, the crew hadn't made a Superman suit for the movie yet, so Snyder had the actor put on the old Christopher Reeve suit since that was all they had. Cavill put on the costume thinking he couldn't believe he was actually wearing Superman's suit. His next thought was he was too fat to be wearing it. Well, too late now. He stepped out of the trailer, and Snyder would recall that everyone went quiet and people were heart attack serious. He just had the right energy, and they were in awe of him. Snyder knew in that moment he had found his Superman. But the director must have had a good poker face because Cavill had no idea he was Superman yet. In fact, he went home, booted up his computer, and lost himself in the immersive video game World of Warcraft. He was in a particularly difficult and important dungeon when his phone rang. I'll get that later, he thought. After several rings, Cavill finally glanced at the phone and barely caught the name Zack Snyder. He quickly swept up the phone and answered, but he was too late. He'd missed it. He quickly called the director back saying he was sorry he missed the call. He was busy saving someone. How appropriate since Snyder was congratulating him on being Superman. The moment was surreal for him and difficult to process. He looked in the mirror and said, "I'm Superman." He'd come so close to big parts before and then was let down. He tried calling his family, but no one was picking up. When he was finally able to tell them, he would say they were making all the right noises, but he could tell they didn't really know what to say either. This was a whole new world. His nephews knew exactly what to say. One of them showed up to school in his Superman costume, which caused the teacher to call home and say, "I don't know what's going on with your boys. They're lying to me because they're telling me their uncle is Superman." Their uncle was Superman. About 3 months into production, when Cavill was face-to-face with his Krypton father Jor-El, who just happened to be the one and only Russell Crowe,
I finally said to him, "Do I know you from somewhere?" And he got this little smile in his eyes and went, "Do you remember going to Stowe School?" "Yeah." "Yes, that's me." I said, "Really? What did I say?" And he said, "Well, you said they pay you pretty well, but they treat you like shit." And I said, "Yes, I did."
Crowe laughed and said, "Oh my God, it is you." The boy who had taken a step and come 1,000 miles was now the Man of Steel. Amy Adams had been up for Lois Lane just as many times as Cavill had been for Superman.
I intend to unpack mine.
Just like him, she'd been promising for Flyby and beat out for Superman Returns. Perhaps her pairing with Henry was just meant to be. As a child growing up as a Mormon in Colorado, Adams was in love with Christopher Reeve's Superman. She even memorized the poem Margot Kidder's Lois Lane recites on her flight with Superman, but instead of being an actress, the young girl would grow up wanting to be a ballerina instead. She would find her way to Hollywood by way of dinner theater in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and audition for the 1999 film Drop Dead Gorgeous, where Cheers star Kirstie Alley would encourage her to pursue a career in film.
Hi, Pat. Go Muskies, woo!
At 25, she moved to Los Angeles, and her initial experience was dark and bleak. She was able to land small parts in television series like That 70s Show,
Hello, Wisconsin!
Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and even an episode of Smallville. But by the time she was 30, she was considering quitting acting altogether when she signed on for a tiny independent comedy drama called Junebug, and she was nominated for an Academy Award for Best Supporting Actress. Her star was on the rise, and by February 2011, the 36-year-old actress was once again fighting to play Lois Lane. She knew this was likely the last chance she'd ever have. Also up for the role was Kristen Stewart, Zoe Saldana, Olivia Wilde, and Mila Kunis, among others.
That totally works.
No.
Yeah, it does.
It doesn't work.
But when Snyder met with Adams, he saw the quality he was looking for in Lois Lane. To Zack, the role was vital to the success of the movie. If he was going to make Superman relevant and real, then Lois had to complement him in every way. And he felt Adams had that quality he was looking for. Snyder phoned her from Paris while he was promoting his 2011 movie Sucker Punch to give her the good news. She was ecstatic. She'd finally gotten the role she'd been trying to play for 9 years. And for fans who were disappointed that Lois Lane wasn't sporting her comic book dark hair color, don't blame it on Adams. She offered to color her hair, but Snyder wanted her natural hair color to double down on the realism he wanted for his characters. Contrary to popular belief, she's not a natural redhead, referring to herself as having a strawberry or dirty blonde hair color. But despite some questions about her not having Lois's hair color, many fans would say she brought the spunk and intelligence the character was known for.
What's the S stand for? How about...
When Goyer was asked why Zod was chosen as the villain for Man of Steel, he said, "The way Nolan and I have always approached movies is to never say, hey, which villain would be cool in this movie? You start with the story you want to tell. We work that out first, and then usually the villain becomes obvious." Snyder would explain that Zod is not only one of Superman's most formidable enemies, but he also has insights on him that other villains don't. Snyder wanted a powerful actor in the role. He wanted Daniel Day-Lewis badly, as he was known to completely transform into his characters. But at that time, Lewis was immersed in becoming President Lincoln for the 2012 biopic. Viggo Mortensen was also nearly selected for the role, but scheduling conflicts with his other work made it impossible. This brought Snyder to another actor that he thought could convey both physical strength and a sense of chilling menace. Michael Shannon was playing the intense character of Agent Van Alden in HBO's Boardwalk Empire when he got the call from Snyder. It was March 2011, and Snyder flew Shannon out from New York to his home in Pasadena, California to pitch him the movie. He had received a Best Supporting Actor Academy Award nomination for his role in 2008's Revolutionary Road, but he wasn't exactly a big Hollywood star being offered huge movies.
It doesn't seem real.
He sat in Snyder's living room as the director walked him through the entire movie and told him he was going to be Zod. Shannon was confused. It sounded like Snyder was offering him the part of the main villain of the film, the part that Terrence Stamp played in 1978's Superman the movie, a role he himself revered.
Really? Terrence Stamp?
Shannon, still confused as to why he was being asked to play the role, asked Snyder couldn't he get anyone to do this part, but Snyder told him he wanted him.
And I thought, yeah, this story's important. It was a totally different take on Zod.
Shannon would never audition for the part. After doing a couple chemistry tests with Cavill, who for several years Shannon couldn't remember if his first name was Henry or Harry, the studio would sign off on him and Snyder had his Zod. Despite Shannon's flippant nature, he would become fiercely loyal to Snyder years later as Superman and what would become the DC Extended Universe began a course correction.
I thought that was beautiful and heartbreaking, but I also just like Zack so much. I really, really like Zack Snyder a lot.
But we'll get back to that a little later. For the roles of Jonathan and Martha Kent, Snyder wanted serious actors to ground his movie, and specifically the story about young Clark learning to deal with his powers. He couldn't get more serious than Kevin Costner and Diane Lane. Costner would later joke that when he first read the script, he was disappointed because he was one of the only people who didn't have powers. But they made him a farmer, and he thought, well, I can definitely play that part. Costner would have what many fans argue is one of the most intense and heart-wrenching scenes in the movie and biggest life lesson for Clark. Snyder chose Lane because he felt she could convey the wisdom and wonder of a woman whose son has powers beyond her imagination. As we mentioned before, Russell Crowe would be chosen to play Superman's Krypton father, Jor-El. Nolan wanted a huge name to play the character, and the final 3 actors being considered were Sean Penn, Clive Owen, and Crowe. The movie star was excited to finally be in a movie his sons could watch.
It was like, finally, I've made a movie that they care about.
He was also a huge Marlon Brando fan, and he felt like taking the role was stepping into the shoes of one of his greatest heroes. Although a couple things surprised him about the role. First was that he was also going to be in spandex, which meant a lot more exercise than he had planned, but also how heavy-going the script would be. He would later admit that even after filming was done, he never fully grasped everything that was in the script. But it could have fooled fans, as his performance as Jor-El was one of the performances people would walk away from the movie loving.
We wanted you to learn what it meant to be human first, so that one day, when the time was right, you can save all of them.
Other notable cast members in the movie included Lawrence Fishburne as the Daily Planet editor-in-chief Perry White, Harry Lennox as Lieutenant General Calvin Swanwick, and Christopher Milani as Colonel Nathan Hardy.
A good death is its own reward.
Antia Trawa would be cast as Fiora L, General Zod's sub-commander. Interestingly, Gal Gadot was offered the role but declined because she was pregnant at the time. Wonder Woman fans say thank you. Prior to filming, Warner Brothers pushed the Christmas 2012 release date for the film back to June 2013 so it wouldn't compete with Peter Jackson's The Hobbit: An Unexpected Journey. Snyder wouldn't complain about the extra time. Filming began on August 1st, 2011 at an industrial park near DuPage Airport, 29 miles west of downtown Chicago, under the codename Autumn Frost. It was named in honor of Snyder's 14-year-old daughter, who would play a key element in the Henry Cavill Superman story in a few years. Chicago would provide the backdrop for Metropolis, while the Illinois countryside would double as Kansas, and the small town of Plano would be the small town where Kryptonians fight against the military. The Kent farm was built just east of Plano. Edwards Air Force Base in California would be the scene where Superman agrees to be handed over to General Zod. Filming would also take place in Vancouver, Canada on location, and at Burnaby's Mammoth Studios, which was used as the set for Krypton and the spaceship. A new Superman also meant a new suit design. The Man of Steel costume would preserve the color scheme and S logo, but adopt darker tones and would notably not feature the red trunks usually worn by Superman. But Snyder was updating Superman, and he wanted a modern aesthetic that more aligned with the New 52 Comics reboot, which had also removed the trunks. He'd tried to include them in the beginning, but in the end he just couldn't make it work. The reason for the redesigned suit was the production team didn't want the look to be a random ornamental decision. When they decided what Krypton would be like, they needed a suit that matched the culture it came from. All of the people of Krypton wear the chain-like suit, and everyone has their family crest on the chest. When we finally see Superman in his suit, we understand why it looks the way it does. In the film, Cavill's body is more muscular than anyone who had played Superman before. Celebrity trainer Mark Twight, who coached Cavill to get his body ready, asked him if he wanted to use steroids to enhance his muscles. Cavill said no, that just wouldn't be right. He wanted to do it the right way. He would end up putting on a staggering 30 pounds of muscle, consuming 8 meals and 6,000 calories per day to bulk up for the role. Sometimes he ate so much he felt sick, often washing fatty snacks down with whipped cream coconut milkshakes with 1,400 calories in each one. It included a punishing 7-day-a-week, 90-minute-per-day military-style workout for months. Twight, who had trained Crow for Gladiator, even made sure Cavill got 9 hours of sleep each night for proper recovery. The physical change was so immense, it actually changed his attitude, and he became Superman, according to Twight. Cavill would later say the most difficult part of making the movie was his 2 shirtless scenes. Just for those scenes, he cut his calories down to 1,500 per day to reach a 7% body fat, which is a level achieved for bodybuilding contests. Cavill wanted to make sure his abs were as defined as humanly possible and actually managed to pull off an 8-pack. Ladies say thank you.
I want to lick the skin off your body, baby.
The scene would reward his efforts with audiences who felt like the actor truly embodied what Superman's body would actually look like. After his shirtless scene, Snyder had pizza and a tub of ice cream waiting for him. Snyder's vision for the film wasn't all in his head. Man of Steel combines elements from multiple comic books, including Superman the Man of Steel, the Supergirl saga, Superman Last Son, and Superman Earth 1. The movie is so reminiscent of Earth 1 that it's impossible not to notice the resemblance. The graphic novel has the pacing and spectacle of a blockbuster action movie, and mirrors nearly every choice in Man of Steel for young Clark Kent, right down to the bullies, the self-identity questions, and the young man's lack of experience. Snyder brought his signature style to the film, which was heavily influenced by not only his previous work, but his love for comic books and realistic graphic visualization. The use of a single handheld camera in many scenes, combined with slow motion and muted colors, was used to convey Superman's power and the impact of his actions. One of the cool homages the visual effects experts included in the film was the sound of rushing wind whenever Kal-El takes flight. They did it intentionally as a nod to the 1952 Adventures of Superman TV show, which was used whenever Superman would fly away. But you may have noticed a couple of things missing from the movie that's in other Superman films. This was the first feature not to include the character of Jimmy Olsen. Olsen would make a brief appearance in 2016's Batman v Superman. Also missing is the iconic Superman theme by John Williams. Despite the new visual style and look Snyder was bringing to Man of Steel, he loved the John Williams music and wanted to use it. But Warner Brothers felt like the music represented Christopher Reeve's Superman and wanted something new. Hans Zimmer was brought in to create the score. Zimmer had created music for Nolan's Batman trilogy, so he was very familiar with creating music for superheroes. Zimmer and Snyder also brought together some of the greatest drummers in the world to perform on the score. Musicians like Pharrell Williams, Sheila E., Jason Bonham, who's the son of Led Zeppelin legend John Bonham, and many others. The Man of Steel would definitely have its own look and feel for this movie.
We just got done bashing some drums very softly. Very loudly.
Filming would end in February 2012, and the production would go into a 16-month post-production. With 1,500 visual effects shots, the team had a lot of work to do editing the film. According to Snyder, the first cut of Man of Steel was 3 hours and 20 minutes. He had a lot of work to do to get down to its 2 hour and 23-minute theatrical cut. One of the scenes cut was of little Kal-El just arriving on Earth and being taken to the doctor's office. When he cried, it broke all the windows in the room. No other full scenes were cut, as they instead chose to trim from different places in the movie. Rumors had been swirling since the announcement of Man of Steel as to whether it would be set in the same universe as the Christopher Nolan Batman movies. Initially, that was exactly what was going to happen. But the idea was scrapped once The Dark Knight Rises ended with Joseph Gordon-Levitt's John Black taking over as Batman for Bruce Wayne. They didn't think the audience would want to see Superman against an alternative version of Batman in a future movie. Nolan would eventually keep the two universes separate, although the pressure for Nolan and Snyder to create a DC extended universe similar to the already popular Marvel Cinematic Universe had been there almost from the beginning. At the start of production on Man of Steel, Disney had Thor, Captain America, and their first Avengers team-up movie all lined up.
I'm a huge fan of the way you lose control and turn into an enormous green rage monster.
Thanks.
The first two Iron Man movies alone had made nearly $1 billion.
I'm just not the hero type, clearly.
Warner Brothers recognized that the age of superhero movies was upon the world, and they owned some of the biggest and the best. The problem was, the MCU had a huge head start on them. But that wasn't going to keep them from catching up, even if it was the worst thing they could possibly do. Goyer, who would also go on to work on the next DCEU movie with Snyder, would tell the Happy Sad Confused podcast in 2023 that the studio was constantly saying they needed their MCU. Goyer tried to slow everything down by saying,
whoa, let's not run before we walk. Like, hold on. Like, they were very methodical in the way we built it. We just can't jump into all of these things.
What made matters worse was the revolving door of both Warner Brothers and DC executives.
Every 18 months, someone new would come in, and someone new would come in, and someone new would come in.
Right.
And we were just getting whiplash.
One comment he got after an early executive screening was one of the suits telling the team they couldn't use the pod baby Superman arrived in to bring down Zod's ship because if you destroy it, how will Superman get home to Krypton?
Wait, what?
There was a long pause before someone said, Krypton blew up. You just saw 30 minutes of it.
Krypton is my kryptonite.
And ignorance wasn't the only problem. Every new person that came in would say,
You know, I would say even go bigger.
Go bigger.
I think we need to go bigger.
Go bigger.
Goyer remembered one new executive pitched 20 movies over the next 10 years. Goyer was beside himself.
None of which were written yet, and like it was just so crazy
How much architecture was being built on air. For Goyer, this is not how you build a house, let alone a movie franchise. But the money gods had spoken, and bottom line feeding executives weren't about to let their screenwriter, or anyone else for that matter, dictate the plan.
Hubba, 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 money, 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 who do you trust?
2 months before the movie was being released, Warner Brothers president Jeff Robinoff confirmed that Man of Steel was setting the tone for movies going forward, including introducing well-known characters into the same world. While Snyder was able to fend off most of the studio's pressure to give us our MCU, there are some references to the larger universe, including a Booster Gold comic sign, a sign that says "Keep Calm and Call Batman," a Star Labs building sign where Cyborg is created, and a Wayne Industries satellite, among many others. Justice League was coming, whether it was too soon or not. Man of Steel held a red carpet premiere at the Lincoln Center's Alice Tully Hall in New York City on June 10, 2013. It would receive a wide release 4 days later. The movie would make $670 million worldwide and finish 9th for the year, coming in just behind Gravity and just ahead of Thor: Dark World. Not bad earnings for a reported budget of $375 million, including marketing. But the critics were split mostly down the middle, with some believing it was an exhilarating action spectacle, while others would say it was a mostly underwhelming film lacking any lightness or joy and showing frustration with Superman killing Zod. Still, others would call it the iconic Superman movie for a whole new generation, while praising the performances of Kevin Costner, Russell Crowe, and Michael Shannon. As for Cavill, most criticism wasn't targeted at him. In fact, most detractors felt like the story failed him and not the other way around. But one thing was certain: Henry Cavill was a perfectly respectable Superman. In fact, for a whole new generation of people, he would become their Superman. And all any of those fans wanted to know was, when are we going to get to see him again? There was no doubt Henry Cavill's Superman would be back, but trouble was already brewing at Warner Brothers. 8 days before the release of the movie, Robinoff had publicly predicted that Man of Steel would be its highest performing movie ever. He was certain, but to do that, the movie would have to beat out the $1.3 billion Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows Part 2. Yes, Man of Steel would be the biggest box office Superman movie ever, but it wasn't even close to the Harry Potter movie. Man of Steel would end up being number 16 all-time for Warner Brothers.
Are you fucking kidding me?
It wasn't even the biggest movie for Warner Brothers in 2013. It was third behind The Hobbit, The Desolation of Smaug, and Gravity. Nolan's third Dark Knight movie would break $1 billion the year before and cost about the same as Superman. And to make matters worse for the studio, Man of Steel wasn't even the biggest superhero movie of the year.
Fuck you, I quit! I'm done.
The MCU's Iron Man 3 crushed the box office for $1.2 billion. The Warner Brothers and Disney lots are literally blocks from each other in Burbank. How much more badly would the studio want their MCU now? And it's a shame because when you compare Man of Steel to the earnings for the first Iron Man, Thor, and Captain America movies, it holds its own. But the studio, feeling that they had better superheroes than Marvel, felt that they should be crushing the MCU. And the answer would be team movies from now on, instead of letting each character earn their box office growth with more standalone movies.
What are your superpowers again?
I'm rich.
And adding to the confusion was the departure of Robinoff, who left Warner Brothers less than 2 weeks after Man of Steel's opening. He had been disgruntled about losing out on a promotion to CEO back in January, and he'd been placed in the cone of silence ever since.
It's not the cone of silence.
There were rumblings that the bosses weren't happy with his leadership or his recent decisions with DC movies. What exactly would this mean for Henry Cavill's Superman? Only a month after Man of Steel had launched, Snyder was making a huge announcement at San Diego Comic-Con. A sequel was always in the cards. In fact, Goyer had a 3-picture deal for Man of Steel, a sequel, and Justice League with Superman.
Just like a bat. I dig it.
But there were a few things working against Superman getting a solo sequel. Primarily, Warner Brothers wanting its MCU. But Snyder also had a strong desire to adapt The Dark Knight Returns and introduce Batman into the DCEU. In fact, he was going to do a lot more than that. The studio had decided it was going to introduce all of its superheroes in one movie and worry about standalone movies later. The belief was that Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman are more popular than anything Marvel could possibly throw at them, so with that logic, their team-up Justice League movies should beat the Avengers movies. But that's studio thinking.
We gotta go talk to the Warner Brothers.
The truth is, you have to earn the moviegoer's next ticket with the work you did on your last film, even if you have Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman. Iron Man 3 had just proven that when you satisfy fans with 2 good movies, they will show up in droves for the 3rd.
We do need backup. That's your department.
And while the studio was rushing to create its version of the MCU, it also meant less screen time for Superman. And he was the best thing they had going for them. Man of Steel featured Superman in about 60 minutes of the movie, but after sharing screen time with Batman and Wonder Woman, Henry Cavill's Superman would only get about 40 minutes on the big screen compared to Batman's 70 minutes in the sequel, which was now a Justice League movie. But in Snyder's mind, he was creating a 5-movie Superman arc that in the end would ensure generations of Superman fans received a lot of Henry Cavill in the red cape. That is, unless the studio decided to get in the way, and they were doing just that.
Because of course they did!
Once it became obvious that Man of Steel was going to fall short of expectations by half, the Monday morning quarterbacking began, and suddenly executives were questioning Snyder's choices on Man of Steel, which led them to tightening their grip on him for Batman vs. Superman. Ben Affleck, affectionately or perhaps unaffectionately nicknamed Batfleck, was on board as Batman. And Gal Gadot was cast as Wonder Woman, complete with her own wild Amazonian electric guitar theme. Jesse Eisenberg would join the cast as Lex Luthor, causing fans to scratch their heads a bit for that selection. Also back were Amy Adams, Kevin Costner, Diane Lane, Lawrence Fishburne, and Harry Lennox. We would learn that Lennox was actually Martian Manhunter. We would also get quick introductions to Jason Momoa's Aquaman, Ezra Miller's Flash, and Ray Fisher's Cyborg. It was Justice League or bust, baby. But first, Snyder had to figure out how to get there. He knew he wanted the samurai to gather his other samurai. Batman had to be the one to bring together the Justice League.
I hear you can talk to fish.
But he wasn't going to be able to do that with Superman in the way. His first thought was to maybe encase the Man of Steel in ice and have him float off into space for a while, but that wouldn't be quite dramatic enough. No, Superman would have to die. Speaking of problems with the writing, Nolan, who was still producing the sequel, but only serving as an advisor, had some advice for Goyer. Don't write the script for this movie. Nolan told him, we've done our Batman thing, let's just leave it with that. But Goyer wouldn't take the advice and wrote the script anyway. Rumors were that Affleck wouldn't take the role unless he and his writing friend Chris Terrio could rewrite the script. No wonder Batman had more screen time. And since the studio wanted bigger, better, and more, I
told you to make it bigger!
Snyder's vision was becoming more and more compromised by studio interference. Filming would begin October 19, 2013 at East Los Angeles College to shoot the football game between Gotham City University and their rival Metropolis State University. Originally, the film's release was slated for July 2015, but in January 2014, the studio moved the release to May 2016 to give Snyder more time to realize his vision.
I see what you did there.
When it was learned Captain America Civil War was releasing the same week as their movie, Warner Brothers would yet again move the release up a month and a half to avoid the competition.
On the roost!
Hey everyone.
A studio insider would say they weren't flinching going against Civil War. This was just a fantastic corridor for them, although it didn't seem that way. Filming would wrap on December 5th, 2014 and enter a 14-month post-production. And it would need the time. The original cut of Batman v Superman: Dawn of Justice was nearly 4 hours long. The theatrical release would end up being 2 hours and 31 minutes. The movie would release worldwide on March 25th, simultaneously in 30,000 theaters. Batman v Superman had a worldwide opening of $422 million, which was the fourth biggest ever at that time. Things were looking great. Then came week 2. In its second week, Batman v Superman experienced a historic box office drop with an 81.2% decline. The biggest Friday-to-Friday drop any blockbuster had ever seen. And it wasn't even facing any competition. The memorable God's Not Dead 2 and that Mike Epps classic Meet the Blacks, that was it.
It's a little ironic that your name is Black because
Don't
you are.
say it.
In fact, Warner Brothers wouldn't face any competition until The Jungle Book on April 15th. They were right. The corridor was great for the movie. So what went wrong? Batman v Superman was by no means a failure. It earned a total of $875 million worldwide against a reported budget of $410 million with marketing. But the studio was certain that Batman and Superman fighting to the literal death with Wonder Woman by their side should make them the #1 movie that year. But that would go to Marvel and Captain America: Civil War, which brought in nearly $1.2 billion all by itself.
The Avengers. That's what we call ourselves. Sort of like a team. Earth's mightiest heroes type thing.
That year, Disney took the top 5 movies, with 4 of them breaking $1 billion. Batman v Superman would be 7th. Warner Brothers was losing the superhero team-up movie fight. Like Man of Steel and the upcoming Suicide Squad movie releasing in a few months,
I can't wait to show you my toys.
Batman v Superman's drop was largely due to a bad critical reception and mixed word of mouth from audiences. The 28% rotten rating it received is all that needs to be said. Perhaps Robbie Collin of the Daily Telegraph said it best when he wrote, "No major blockbuster in years has been this incoherently structured and this seemingly uninterested in telling a story with clarity and purpose." But the review that would stick a dagger in the heart of Warner Brothers executives would be the one like this one, Rafer Guzman of Newsday, where he said, "Overlong, underdeveloped, and almost entirely humorless. Batman v Superman may please die-hard fans by pitting 2 DC icons against each other, but everyone else may want to wait for the next Marvel movie." Ouch.
Oh, snap.
And unfortunately, the critical failure of the movie wouldn't encourage the studio to be less hands-on. In fact, it would be more. Even a release of the Ultimate Edition of the movie wouldn't stave the hands of the studio. The 31-minute longer version of Batman v Superman would come out 3 months later. The studio had shortened Snyder's vision for the movie to maintain a PG-13 rating for the wide release, but they had planned the Ultimate Edition to boost media home sales. The Ultimate Edition would provide more depth for Superman in the movie. The edition cleared up subplots, and the studio hoped it would help cool down negative sentiment, which it did to some degree. Despite all that, the movie had nearly doubled its earnings and revenue, which meant, despite the poor reception, the studio would be forging ahead with more Justice League. The question was, would they be doing it with Zack Snyder? Snyder had been set to direct the Justice League movie since the beginning of post-production on Batman v Superman, way back in April 2014. In October of that year, Warner Brothers announced the film would be released in 2 parts, with the first hitting box offices in November 2017 and the second in June 2019. Snyder would later clarify that it was 2 standalone movies and not 2 halves of one movie. But something else was happening behind the scenes. According to Snyder, he felt like the studio had a hatred for Batman v Superman.
They talk about us. They love it. They hate it. But they're talking about.
He said there was a constant pressure for him to divorce Justice League from the previous film, but he didn't want to do that. The story needed to continue. He still had his 5-movie arc in his mind. It was Man of Steel, Batman v Superman, and 3 Justice League movies that would tell the whole arcing story of Darkseid's invasion and Superman's corruption by the anti-life equation. But thanks to not meeting box office expectations, studio executives were losing faith in Snyder's vision.
And make no mistake, I will fucking kill you.
According to The Wrap, several executives went to then Warner Brothers president Greg Silverman and asked him to remove Snyder from Justice League.
Remove the king's crown, please, Daddy.
Silverman didn't fire the director. According to the story, he was quite harsh on him and ordered massive rewrites and tonal changes in an attempt to appease BVS critics, but it didn't fit with what Snyder was building at all.
Hey! Can I get a Snyder cut?
Warner Brothers CEO Kevin Suihara would allow Snyder to stay on, but would mandate that the Justice League movie could not exceed 2 hours, which restricted Snyder's vision even further. Principal photography on Justice League started only days after BVS's release, so there would have been more problems trying to remove the director at that time. There were many issues, but trouble really began when Warner Brothers realized their plans didn't line up with Snyder's. He wanted his characters to have a precise endpoint, while the studio wanted a more open-ended endeavor similar to what the MCU was doing. No surprise there.
I might as well say directed by Joss Whedon.
They also didn't want to have to reboot everything again in a few years. So what could a studio do if it wanted to be the next MCU? Well, how about hire someone who made not one, but 2 Avengers movies?
Bunch of functional idiots.
During production on Justice League, while Snyder was still working on the film, Warner Brothers set up a footage summit where they met with other writers about the film. This included Joss Whedon, who had directed the MCU's Avengers in 2012 and Avengers Age of Ultron in 2015.
People think Joss Whedon sold out when he did the Avengers.
Because he did! The studio was determined to put out a movie closer to what they thought fans wanted to see. Warner Brothers CEO Suihara assigned DC watchdogs to the production in the form of Jeff Johns and John Berg. At least one of them was required to be on the set every day. Berg recalls it being a low point for him. His job was to mediate between a creator whose vision was instinctually dark and a studio that felt fans wanted something lighter. Snyder felt like he was being babysat. In January 2017, Snyder showed his first cut of the film to Suihara, and it didn't go well. He was ordered to make it shorter.
Make it shorter.
But the problem was, he just didn't see how. How was he supposed to introduce 6 characters and an alien with potential for world domination in 2 hours? He just didn't see it. It was at that time that Whedon had been asked to do rewrites on Justice League.
Joss Whedon?
Snyder thought maybe he could write something cool and it would be fun. Then the unthinkable happened. On March 12th, Snyder's 20-year-old daughter committed suicide by overdose of prescription drugs. Snyder was crushed. He tried to continue on dealing with his grief by finishing the movie, but it soon became clear that Warner Brothers was giving Whedon more and more power. The movie was in post-production, but the studio wanted reshoots. Whedon was no longer just advising, he was also doing some directing himself. Snyder couldn't fight the studio and grieve his daughter, so he quit. It was a tragedy for the director, but for the studio, it was an opportunity for them to make the course correction they desperately wanted to make.
Board jokes means board tickets sold.
Even though Snyder had completed filming, Whedon would rewrite and reshoot about 3/4 of the Justice League. Whedon was brought in to save the movie, but according to a studio executive who requested anonymity, what Whedon did was stupefying and everyone knew it. The studio executive said it was awkward at Warner Brothers because nobody wanted to admit what a piece of shit this movie was.
Bad movie.
Despite only being in the movie for 20 minutes, some of those reshoots included new scenes for Henry Cavill's Superman. But the problem was, he was still shooting Mission Impossible 6 and contractually couldn't shave his mustache. The studio chose to use CGI to try and remove it, although everybody could tell. What the studio should have done is delay the release of the movie, which was only a few months away. But Suihara and new Warner Brothers president Toby Emmerich didn't want to because they were afraid they would lose the bonuses they would receive when AT&T and Time Warner merged by the end of the year. Yep, that's right. When push came to shove, it really was all about the money.
When did it become all about the money?
Justice League would hit theaters in the United States on November 17, 2017, and flop. Despite making $661 million worldwide, it was reported that the movie needed to make $750 million just to break even. Reviews would say things like, the contempt that Justice League has for its audience is open, unashamed, and matter of fact. What was supposed to be a superhero extravaganza from the DC universe feels instead like a sloppy remake of Avengers. Boom. Despite that, Warner Brothers may not have been done making DCEU movies, but in the fandom, a low rumble had begun. And over the next several years, it would get louder and louder. Release the Snyder Cut.
Release the Snyder Cut. Release the Snyder Cut. Release the Snyder Cut.
When Snyder left Warner Brothers, he took his laptop home. On the hard drive was his original, nearly 4-hour version of Justice League. There were no visual effects or music, and it was in black and white. To him, it was a memento. Maybe he would show it to his friends. After the release of the theatrical version, which Snyder famously would never watch, the fans of Justice League created a Change.org petition to release the Snyder Cut of the film, and it quickly got over 100,000 signatures. These things usually fade away, but the demand only grew over the years. Groups paid to have airplanes fly Release the Snyder Cut banners over the Warner Brothers lot and at Comic-Con in San Diego. Snyder secretly wanted to make it. He also wanted to support the growing movement, but he was afraid the studio would either sue him or silence him. But in November 2019, he finally got behind the movement and helped push the Release the Snyder Cut hashtag on Twitter. Both Gadot and Affleck were calling for it to be released as well.
There was a huge Twitter campaign that had gone on that was joined by Gal and Jason and Ben and Ray and to release the Snyder Cut. And that was when I got a call from the studio to say, what is that? What is the reality of releasing the Snyder Cut?
A few days later, Emmerich called Snyder with an offer. Let's try again. Initially, Warner Brothers just wanted to release the raw footage on his laptop, but that was a hard no for him. And Snyder didn't trust their motivations. He thought it was an attempt to just get the internet off the studio's back. Emmerich asked him what he wanted to do. So Snyder told him, I need about $70 million to undo Whedon's redo. For that, the HBO Max streaming service gets 4 hours of hotly anticipated programming and the Hollywood comeback story of a lifetime. All he wanted was total creative control, and they gave it to him. Zack Snyder's Justice League was released on March 18, 2021 on the HBO Max streaming service at a whopping 4 hours and 2 minutes long. Critics overwhelmingly praised the cut, saying it lives up to its title and should satisfy the fans who brought it into existence. It was a triumph for Snyder and Henry Cavill Superman fans, but it was also bittersweet. Despite what seemed like a huge success for Snyder's vision, Warner Brothers didn't seem interested in continuing to tell the story. Not with Snyder, at least. There were also concerns about seeing Henry Cavill's Superman again on the big screen. Cavill was becoming a hot commodity in Hollywood, but he still wanted to play Superman. When Warner Brothers tried to get him to do a cameo in 2019 Shazam, rumors began that Cavill wanted a new Superman movie in exchange for doing the part. It would never happen. It was obvious that the studio wasn't in any hurry to focus on Superman anytime soon. Fans of who Henry Cavill was their Superman would only ever get 121 minutes of him in the suit. But that last minute would nearly launch his Superman back into the world again. In 2022, whether or not Henry Cavill would ever play Superman again was still unknown. But the biggest movie star on the planet was making a superhero movie, and he was a huge fan of Cavill's Superman. Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson had spent a decade trying to get Black Adam made. He wanted to establish him as the most powerful, unstoppable force in the DC universe. But the only way he could do that is if he faced the most powerful, unstoppable force of all time in the universe. And for that, you need Henry Cavill's Superman. Johnson, who shared a manager with Cavill, lobbied hard to get him a cameo in the movie. But the president of DC Films, Walter Hamada, who was overseeing the production of DCEU films since 2018, wouldn't allow it. But Johnson wasn't having it. He went around Hamada, asking Warner Brothers co-CEOs Michael DeLuca and Pamela Abdy permission, and they gave it. What no one knew at the time was that Hamada had offered James Gunn a Superman movie before he did 2021's The Suicide Squad. Hamada was in the market for a new Superman and didn't want to bring back Cavill. Johnson got the cameo, And when Black Adam aired on October 21st, 2022, Superman fans lost their minds when he showed up on the end credits scene. Henry Cavill's Superman was back. Or so everyone thought. Hamada, so upset over the decision, stepped down from his position. 4 days after the release of Black Adam, James Gunn was named the co-head of DC Studios alongside Peter Safran. And as we would quickly learn, he was not in the Henry Cavill Superman business. Less than 2 months later, after talking with the studio, Cavill, now 39, would announce to the world that he was retiring as Superman for good. Warner Brothers and DC was rebooting Superman again. While the story of Henry Cavill's Superman was never finished and we'll forever wonder what 2 more Zack Snyder movies would have looked like, one thing we know for sure is that Cavill and Snyder had both wanted to shape his Superman into the hopeful and optimistic hero many fans see him as. What we did get from Cavill is a new Superman for a new generation. Everyone has their Superman. For some, it's Reeves, and for many others, it's Reeve. For some, it's even Routh. And for the bulk of people alive today, their Superman is Henry Cavill. A lot of how people feel about Cavill's Superman will unfold as DC now explores David Cornsweet's vision of the character. Only time will tell, but for those who love Snyder's vision and Cavill's interpretation of the Man of Steel, there will always be a high place for him in the history of Superman. But what do you think? Where does Henry Cavill rank among your all-time favorite Supermen? How do you rank Man of Steel next to Superman the movie and Superman Returns? Do you feel like Cavill was cheated? And more importantly, how do you feel when you get to the end of the Zack Snyder cut and you see the final scene with Batman and Joker and you know Superman is coming? Do you feel a sense of loss, or are you okay with letting your imagination finish the story for you? Share with us your favorite moments and stories from the franchise in the comments below. We'd love to talk with you about it. If you enjoyed this definitive history and would like to hear the behind-the-scenes stories of how we made it and perhaps some of the things we left out, just click on the join button and become a member of the channel, where we host a live interactive show after each new video. And once again, thank you for supporting the channel. We couldn't do this without you. A link is about to pop up that will take you directly to these limited collector's edition designs. Every dollar earned goes towards making our next video. Don't forget to get a nice discount by using coupon code THEPOPCAST at checkout. Until next time,